So, okay. Yeah, so today we will talk about, like I mentioned, common threats, trying to map out some of the space of types of attacks and security risks that we have to deal with all the time in today's world. So, and this is, of course, a ever constantly evolving and changing threat space, but there are a lot of categories of threats and risks and types of attacks that are especially common. And so, you know, we'll just kind of do a high-level overview, but a lot of in this session, but a lot of different territory. And later in the course, we'll get more into more specific, you know, details on some of these types of attacks and defenses. So first, we'll cover a few just general concepts on kind of categorizing threats and attacks, and go through some kind of common practice in terms of thinking about the life cycle of attacks. Well, I'm sure hackers have lifestyle too, but life cycle of attacks. And what often motivates them. They often come from different motivations, and that affects a lot in terms of the way they're carried out and how they affect us. And then I'll look at a number of more specific classes of threats. So there are various definitions of threats in information security. ISO has a very brief one: a potential cause of an incident that may result in harm of systems or organizations. It's brief and to the point. NIST, U.S. National Institute of Standards of Technology, has a slightly more verbose definition in one of their standards. Their standards are called FIPS, Federal Information Processing Standards. So any circumstance or event with the potential to adversely impact organizational operations, blah, 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 organization assets, individuals via unauthorized access, destruction, disclosure, modification of information, and or denial of service, right? So, yeah, somewhat more specific, but, perhaps also somewhat more brittle. I'm sure somebody is soon going to invent something that's not on that list. So let's look at some of the categories of threats. And one way we can break them down is into physical versus non-physical. So, information systems are ultimately physical things. Information sits on laptops and servers that actually have a physical embodiment somewhere. And those, things can go wrong with them for a variety of reasons. They get flooded, or, the building they're in burns down. Many other physical factors, or they just, lose power, or things like that, or they fail. Or, in a, increasingly rare case, at least for data centers and things like that, for servers, it's probably not that common that an attacker physically breaks into the data center and carries off a bunch of servers. They're big and heavy. Of course, it's a lot more common when we're talking about laptops or mobile devices, just physical theft. But we're going to focus most on the non-physical types of attacks that where nobody's attacking the system directly, but using different methods of gaining inappropriate entry or access. Right. So a threat is a potential source of an attack, a potential source of a problem. An exploit is a tool, is a vulnerability in a system that an attacker can use to actually get in, to get inappropriate access. So, for example, an exploit, very commonly exploits are software bugs that malware uses to raise its privilege or get access to a file or something that it wasn't intended to be able to access, and take over a system or get raised privilege from user mode to supervisor mode or things like that. So, but exploits are a very broad class. So some exploits are basically exploiting the vulnerabilities of humans. This is what we call social engineering. We'll get into some examples of that. Basically, hacking the human users of systems by taking advantage of our vulnerabilities, our imperfections in the way we behave and the way we interact with other people. Of course, many exploits, like I mentioned, exploit software bugs. Many of these exploits are actually known. The exploits that actually get used probably 90-some% of the time to cause the vast majority of damage are actually exploits of bugs that are already known and fixed in some version of the operating system or some version of the software in some cases, but those fixed versions haven't been updated everywhere, and so many to are for software bugs that that many systems are fixed, but there are still enough unpatched systems out there that that they still provide a strong opportunity for hackers. We call software bugs, the exploitable software bugs that are not already known at the time they're used, we call 0 days, meaning we had 0 days of warning that the exploit exists before the hacker started using it, right? So a 30-day exploit, would be an exploit that kind of was publicly disclosed 30 days before some hacker figuring out how to use it. A 0 day is when the hacker found it first, and we basically discovered because it was getting used. Because these 0-day exploits are rare and they go for very high prices either on the black market or in bug bounty programs, like there's a $500,000 bug bounty for 0-day exploits, certain 0-day exploits in iOS. Okay. And then, independent of software bugs, there's attacks on the behaviors of systems that don't exactly exploit bugs necessarily. Well, we can argue about the definition of bugs. Maybe you could say these are attacks against performance bugs as opposed to logic bugs in software. Attacks such as distributed denial of service that just overloads a system with traffic so that it can't keep up with the load and can't serve its normal users. And then side channel attacks, which we'll get into later, right? So machines, when a hacker can get to a machine, like I mentioned, hackers often have many different motivations. And if you've hacked a machine, there's a huge variety of things you might end up wanting to do with it. And this is kind of a rough taxonomy of some of these classes. For example, a hacker often might turn it into a web server. It's a normal machine in your home, but if they can open a public IP address and turn it into a web server, then they can turn it into a phishing site or a website that tries to trick people into doing bad things, and the hackers don't want to set up their own web servers on actual servers they own, somewhere where they live or that can be traced back to them. So when the hackers want to run a web server that's doing something truly sketchy or illegal, always better to co-opt somebody else's machine to do that, so that it's hard to trace back to you if the cops actually track down that server and look what's on it. Hacked PCs are used to send spam emails, to send all kinds of emails, phishing spam, harvesting contacts, all kinds of things. They can be used to try to steal virtual goods, like game license keys, or that kind of that great. Well, I used to say World of Warcraft, swords and stuff like that. I know, they're new games, newer games than World of Warcraft. I'm revealing my age, sorry, but all kinds of things. This actually needs to be updated. It really needs to be updated to include Bitcoin wallets, right? So. You can be sure that any hacker these days that's breaking into your system is looking for anything that looks like a Bitcoin private key or Ethereum private key with a wallet whose funds it can steal. And then they can look for account credentials, like your passwords for your various accounts online, which they can then take over and use for further purposes, right? Financial credentials and hostage-taking attacks like ransomware, which we'll get into. Hold your data hostage until you pay. So, huge variety of types of attacks and types of uses for hacked systems for further attacks. So let's take a look at kind of the cyber attack lifestyle, the life cycle, the type of process that many of these attacks tend to follow. Now, some of this probably applies more to some attacks than others, but hackers are getting more and more systematic and more careful in general about how they attack, and more and more, let's say, professional about how they carry out this process. And so in a typical attack, the hackers will figure out who they're trying to attack and why, the class of systems. It could be very broad, could be very narrow, but define what type, who the target is, or what type of systems are the target, what tools they're likely to need based on what they do or don't know about the target. Research the target. If they're attacking a company, they're going to find out about whatever they can about the employees that work there, especially the system administrators, the executives, the people that might have good credentials that are especially privileged credentials that can be exploited to do other things if they can be successfully exploited. Prepare watering holes or traps. So these are often, the attackers might prepare, look at your company's website and copy it. Say, okay, here's, I see that this is the login page for your bank. Maybe even open an account on your bank to be able to see the whole login process, what everything looks like. Take screenshots throughout the thing, and then prepare offline, a fake version of that website that looks maybe pixel for pixel, font for font, identical to the real thing as a watering hole. So maybe register a fake domain name or 2 or 3 or 100 based on misspellings of the company name. So and direct that to this watering hole website in hopes that some maybe small but non-negligible portion of the employees who are or other people who are typing in that that domain name will misspell it slightly and go to the hacker's version of the website instead, enter their login credentials, and thereby give the hacker copies of their passwords and stuff, right? So that's a very common type of watering hole attack. And so And sophisticated attackers will spend, a significant amount of time before an attack, often, kind of preparing and figuring out, well, how to set it up to trap people into falling for the tricks. So then, of course, they actually have to gain access somehow. So they have to have, they might try a variety of attacks, and most of those attacks don't succeed, or they try to attack many different people, different employees, and most of those don't fall for it. But one or two do, a few do. And so in that case, they have an initial intrusion, a foot in the door, as we say. Now, often that foot in the door doesn't necessarily give the hacker all that much power initially. So they've compromised the account of, a low-level random employee who doesn't actually have much access, but the attacker can see, who maybe can see, what other employees this employee has been talking to. Maybe use that to identify who the employer's managers are, who the system administrators are that the employee has been interacting with to get technical problems answered. Basically use that foot in the door to get a lot more information. And then at the technical level, the attacker can then also use the employee's access to map the network, to explore, okay, now I'm inside the corporate firewall. I can run network scans or port scans and stuff inside that are likely to be much more effective and much less likely to be detected than trying to run a port scan or network scan from outside that's just going to hit the corporate firewall, right? So that initial foot in the door, the initial intrusion, is usually the critical first step, but usually doesn't give the attacker what they're eventually looking for. And so a sophisticated attacker will then take steps to maintain access and build their access, strengthen their foothold, for example, by installing rootkits, which we'll get into later. So the initial exploit might only give access, within the context of one login, but as soon as the machine gets rebooted for whatever reason, the attacker's access is going to go away. Well, if they install a rootkit or some other persistent malware, then they can try to make sure that their access will persist even after the machine is rebooted. And then they often install further tools to be able to monitor, like keyloggers and screen, remote desktop access tools. So, as the employee is typing and looking at the screen, the attacker can see the screen and see what they're typing as well. So if they happen to, type a password onto another website, internal or external, the attacker can see exactly what that password was. And so basically, attackers use this kind of access to try to use as the time they haven't been discovered yet to their maximum advantage, to get more information and get a stronger foothold, strengthen their access, and get more privilege in the network. And also move laterally, as we say. So, I've compromised this user's account, but they have these friends who they're close to, and I can map this part of the network. Maybe I can exploit some of the other nodes in that part of the network as well, and move around. Yeah.
What do you mean by privileged connection?
Yeah, so we'll get into that more later, but in all standard, at least desktop operating systems, Windows and Mac OS and things like that, also mobile operating systems like iOS, normal applications run with limited privilege levels. Like a normal application can't usually install or remove other software or access other users' data, only the one user's data, right? But the very first thing that when an attacker gets malware into your system, it often exploits an application first, and that malware only runs with application privilege. But the first thing the hacker would love to do from that point is get root privilege, or get administrative level privilege on the local system. Exploit a bug in the operating system kernel, for example, so that they can take complete control of the machine. So that's privilege escalation at the local level. That's just one type of privilege escalation. Another type is kind of network-wide. So if I captured the credentials of a low-level employee, but then I can use that to find an administrator account and capture the credentials of an administrator who has stronger access on the in the network-wide Kerberos Microsoft Active Directory authentication system, then administrator credentials are gold for hackers, because they kind of if you can do that, then you're basically escalating your privilege to administrator level, so you kind of take control over the network and can do a lot more things than any single employee could have done, right? So that's generally what we mean by privilege escalation. Break out of the low privilege compartments that might initially be exploited into more privileged access levels. Yeah, good question. Thanks. Okay, so yeah, so attackers try to maintain access, and then kind of once they have the access they need, or they think they need to achieve their objective, whatever that is, then they try to go after, well, whatever it is they're actually after, which might be a lot of different things. If they're doing it for industrial espionage reasons, they might be trying to break into to the servers or the files that store some secret proprietary plans, I don't know, the formula for Coke or something, but or they might be trying to disrupt. They cause a lot of damage, shut down a lot of systems at a very bad time, or just delete a lot of data, right? Or they they're often not particularly interested in this particular system, but they want to use it as a platform for other attacks. And this is often the case for just individual, like home PCs that gets exploited. Often the hackers aren't particularly interested in them, but want to use them as a platform for other attacks. And then finally, if the attacker is trying to be stealthy, trying to avoid getting caught, they're likely to take measures to cover their tracks. The obvious thing is to delete log files or edit the log files to delete any signs of, like, for example, when most operating systems, when a TCP connection comes in or a root login happens, they'll write an entry in a log file. But those log files are just files; they're editable, and hackers will try to edit them to eliminate the evidence if the system administrator actually looks at the log files to try to figure out what's going on. Of course, just deleting the log file itself might not really be effective. There might be a backup of the log file somewhere else, but if the hacker can actually change the application that writes the log file so that it just doesn't write, in the future doesn't write entries that the hacker doesn't want to be written, then that can sometimes be better. And hackers that are extremely careful often use what we call memory-only persistence techniques. For example, if there's a group of machines in a on a corporate network, and some number of them, the hacker has been able to break into some number of them, and the attacker doesn't want to leave any trail of crumbs on any of the disks, so the attackers can design malware that just stays in memory on all the machines. Of course, it gets deleted anytime one of the machines is rebooted, but as long as the vulnerability still persists, then once it's rebooted, then it just immediately gets reinfected by another of the still infected machines on the local area network, right? So, so that's one of the more advanced persistence techniques that avoids leaving any more forensic evidence than necessary, right? And so, again, there's a wide variety of these techniques, but this is kind of a and you know, certainly not all attackers are you know, so careful or systematic as to, you know, think about or worry about all these steps. We're talking about, you know, really about the more sophisticated attackers, but attackers are getting more sophisticated. Okay, so let's look at some of the motivations for attacks, the types of threats. So commodity threats is the term we often use for threats by attackers who aren't particularly targeted. They don't really care who they're attacking. You know, they just want to attack anyone in any system that's attackable. You know, so they're just taking a shotgun approach. Let's just try sending out our malware. Try sending this phishing spam. You know, just try something and see who bites. And the hit rate may be really, really tiny, but maybe that's okay if it's sufficiently cheap to send each phishing spam, or it's automated and they've already have a big botnet and they're trying to, you know, use it to send out phishing spam to everyone in the world to build a bigger botnet. And so they might not need a lot of hit rate, and they don't care, you know, that much about which kind of device they're getting or who owns it. They just want, you know, kind of a bigger empire, a bigger botnet. And so usually these types of attacks are not particularly stealthy. The hackers don't really care about getting detected because most of their targets are, you know, very soft targets. You know, normal people with home PCs that probably don't have any sophisticated, you know, computer knowledge or experience, and probably aren't even keeping the machines up to date, which is why they're, you know, maybe why they're successfully exploited in the first place, right? And so, the goal here is usually very short term. So the hackers just want to kind of opportunistically use this PC to get some kind of financial gain as quickly as possible. And, you know, they assume they might lose access at any time, but, you know, that's okay. They just want to use it for however long the machine stays up and accessible to, you know, send phishing spam or steal Bitcoin wallets or, you know, do whatever they can to use it for financial advantage. So that's how these machines are often used. On the other hand, these machines are also often used as launching points for more sophisticated attacks. So if you're a, you know, more sophisticated attacker, you still want a botnet army, but maybe you use that botnet army a little bit differently. You use it to set up, for example, to set up a several levels deep indirection path, you know, similar to the Tor anonymity system, if you're familiar, to, you know, kind of hop across pretty much innocent, normal, but exploited machines at several levels before you start going and carrying out your actual sophisticated attack against the targeted against the actual target you're trying to attack, so that, you know, if and when somebody sophisticated does discover what you're doing, they'll have a really hard time tracing it back to you, right? And this is one of the reasons that attribution of successful cyber attacks is actually very difficult in practice. You know, you see news items regularly about, well, this or that big exploit or hack occurred. Well, you know, we heard just very recently, right? The Olympics website got hacked immediately at the opening of the Olympics, And it sounded, I haven't read all the details, but it sounded like initially they thought it was North Korea that did it. But it turned out, well, then the story changed that, well, apparently it was Russia trying to pin the blame on North Korea. And, I don't know what the actual truth is or how well or poorly anybody actually knows the sources of some of these attacks. But they're in general not, it's not generally easy to attribute the sources of attacks with certainty. So when they do attribute, they do it not because they could see the connection clearly came from here, that came from this person, this company, this country, but usually, they're using this particular software that looks pretty similar to this, and it uses very similar techniques to these techniques that are known to have been done by this hacking group. Kind of very soft match, and not very and very deniable types of evidence. So its attribution is often very difficult, in part because sophisticated attackers use large botnets and kind of simple commodity exploits to cover the tracks and deliberately make attribution and forensics difficult. So there's been many examples of these. We'll just look at a few. A few years ago, like 6 years ago now, the London Stock Exchange was taken down by basically drive-by malware, this was the kind of malware that basically causes any exploitable Windows machine to show up this big warning box that says, warning, your machine is infected by spyware, which was absolutely true, but it's saying, to fix it, do this. And of course, doing what it says is exactly what the attacker, wants the victims to do. I can't remember exactly what that ended up doing, but basically going and infecting more systems. So those are commodity threats. Another kind of class of motivations is what we call hacktivism, which comes in many forms. In some cases, it's trolling or just hackers wanting to prove that they can do this. Show what they can do. Sometimes it's very politically motivated. Acts of civil disobedience or fighting against censorship and stuff like that, or using distributed denial of service to try to take down a website that the hacktivists see as kind of the opposition, right? So a particularly interesting incident of this happened in 2014 when Sony Pictures came out with this comedy called The Interview. How many of you seen that? You remember? Remember this? Yeah. So the comedy that about a fictional plot to assassinate the then leader of North Korea, now North Korea leader Kim Jong-un, and some hacktivists decided this was super offensive and hacked Sony, and basically blackmailed Sony, say, if you release this movie, we're going to cause you huge problems, and it did cause them huge problems, like $35 million worth of problems. The FBI eventually decided it was a group either in or related to supporting North Korea who did this. Well, not seems reasonably likely. Although again, I'm not sure that whether they ever determine that with certainty. But that's just one of the kind of really big, loud examples of that. So finally, advanced persistent threats are threats that are typically used by literally, very persistent adversaries to against very carefully chosen targets to try to achieve specific objectives, like getting certain types of information, so getting secret information that's very, very useful to the attackers in some way. And the groups that use these techniques often use a very wide range of tools and techniques, a big toolbox. Usually, especially these days, no single exploit gets an attacker all the way to where they want to go. They have to use a whole bunch of, a whole series of exploits and attacks to create a chain. Get that foot in the door and then, escalate privilege, move laterally until they can escalate privilege, get enough information to eventually get the access they need. And so that's what tends to require a big toolbox. And kind of a full spectrum approach. So advanced basically means they're using this whole big toolbox of exploits. Persistent means they typically take it slow. They're not going in with guns blazing in a way that's very likely to be detected. Instead, they try to keep it slow. Like if they're doing any kind of scan, network scan, port scan, or something, either from outside or even inside, they're going to rate limit it. They're not going to send out a huge boatload of traffic that's going to show up clearly on anyone who's monitoring the network. They're going to design it so it's just going to say, ping there, try that, wait a few seconds, try that, and often they try hard to make these probes look, to traffic analysis like reasonably, normal traffic. They try not to make it, make the effects of their attacks stand out. And so they're basically prioritizing long-term or over short-term goals, trying to, keep their attack undetected in order to maximize their eventual advantage and payoff, rather than just kind of immediately grabbing what they can and running. And often the attackers, when they're doing this kind of thing, they'll continuously monitor and interact with the exploited systems. In fact, some of the most sophisticated groups that carry out these types of attacks are known to act as surrogate system administrators for the machines and networks they're attacking, right? So some companies have found that employees have reported, around this certain time, my machine started working a lot better. It started going faster. It wasn't as slow. My Windows machine was really slow before, and then it started going faster. Well, that's because the attacker, in some cases, that's because the attacker was clearing out other malware, other people's malware that those systems were infected with, to make them work better for the attacker, so that the attacker isn't competing with anybody else's malware, any of these normal botnets, and so they literally make the network and the machines work better, so that they can attack more effectively and control the systems more effectively. And so this is very much happened to know. So if your system is sluggish for a while and then mysteriously starts improving, be a little bit suspicious. So so persistence. So that's persistence, and then finally, of course, the threat this is very, very human coordinated, and the attackers are usually skilled and well funded. They're out for not just little financial wins, but significant financial wins. And these are whole groups that can write sophisticated software, right? So There's been many prominent examples of this. Here in Switzerland, a few years ago, there was a very widely reported incident where the RUAG, which is one of the big defense contractors in defense companies in Switzerland, discovered that they had been APT, they had been subject to an advanced persistent threat that successfully got into a number of their systems and stayed there for a matter of months before the attacker was detected and eventually kicked out. And so this was a big long-term successful attack, and I don't even remember if they ever figured out who was behind the attack. Does anybody remember? Anyway, so that was kind of a big deal in Switzerland a couple of years ago. But those are happening all over on a regular basis. So that's the general attack lifestyle and the different types of some of the different motivations for these kinds of attacks. So let's now look at some of the, kind of drill down and look at, specific classes of attacks. Actually, that's maybe a perfect time to take a short break and then talk about attacks. So let's take 10 minutes, 5, 10.